Welcome to the 7th section of the Ethics in Education module. Today, we're going to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown up a lot of multiple ethical dilemmas. We'll need to deploy a lot of the tools we've developed to think through some of these issues. And no doubt, we're not going to agree on what is the best thing to do. But that's okay. If this stuff was easy, we'd have done it a long time ago. It's not easy. It's contradictory and frustrating, emotional and stressful. You remember what we said about confusion? That being confused doesn't mean that you're ignorant or unable to think, but in fact often indicates that you are thinking and that you are grappling with the full depth of the complexity. Fasten your seatbelts. Firstly, let's get a bit of the sociological imagination going about how our own individual problems with the pandemic and its effects on schools relate to broader social issues. I want to start with a quote from Minister Angie Motshekga in her announcement on Sunday, the 7th of June 2020, regarding school readiness to reopen on the 8th of June for grades 12 and 7. She said during the Q&A that followed her speech, "For us as a sector, the coronavirus is mainly a health problem, and then a social, economic, and political problem." I couldn't disagree with the minister more strongly. It's exactly because the political, social, and economic relations that pre-existed COVID are what they are that has made the pandemic so much more devastating. Who is vulnerable? Who can afford to weather an economic knock and who can't? Who can physically distance in their home safely and comfortably and who can't? Who has access to reserve funds for inflated prices and larger hauls of essential supplies so they can avoid going to the shops frequently? Even those who have electricity and water in their homes and who can cook and store food safely, which assumes, of course, they have homes to go to. Who can wash their hands and keep their environment clean and who can't? These simple basic needs to survive the pandemic and to flatten the curve with each successive wave, all of the who's can and who can't fall along lines of class, race, and geography because of our history. As people retreated into their homes under one of the harshest lockdowns in the world in March of 2020, the domestic realm became people's whole lives. For those whose domestic situations are not good, mostly women and children, being cooped up with frustrated, scared, and potentially angry partners and parents, who also might have been withdrawal-afflicted nicotine addicts, meant that reported domestic violence tripled in volume under the first COVID lockdown. Every inequality in our society, class, race, gender, and location, were amplified during the pandemic, including education. And it's really hard to wrap your head around how unequal South Africa really is. We're the most unequal society in the world, but saying so doesn't help us to really understand what that means. Particularly those of us in the middle classes don't quite recognize what it's like for people less fortunate than ourselves. It's invisible to us in ways that it is not for those further down the social and economic ladder. So here are two examples to help you get a sense of it. The first I'd like to offer you is called the SALDRU Income Comparison Tool. SALDRU stands for South African Labour Development Research Unit. Now, before you click on the link, jot down on a piece of paper how much total monthly income comes into your household and how many people live with you on a more or less permanent basis. And you find that income by adding up all the salaries or rental incomes of the different people who bring in money. Then visit the website and follow the steps and see where you sit on the income inequality spectrum. The second example that will help you get a sense of how stark and broad our inequality is the following. When NEDLAC, that's the National Economic Development and Labour Council, announced a minimum wage of 3,500 Rand per month in 2017, many businesses complained that it was too high. that they would go out of business if they had to pay their employees 3,500 Rand a month. That would constitute a wage increase for half of those who are actually employed between the ages 18 and 65. That's right. Half of working South Africans earned less than 3,500 Rand a month at the end of 2017. And that doesn't even include people who don't have work. Now, 3,500 Rand a month works out at about 20 Rand an hour. Think about that in relation to, say, Cape Town rental prices. Why am I telling you this? I'm trying to set the scene. I'm trying to set the scene for what's coming next regarding opening schools. And you can't really wrap your head around the different concerns and perspectives that come from different quarters of society if you don't understand the conditions and circumstances that frame those perspectives. Remember pluralism from session 2? That we can all be reasonable and use reason, but come to very different conclusions because we're starting from different premises. We're going to see a lot of that today. So here are a few basic figures just to get us started on understanding our basic education system and how it mirrors broader inequality in our society. So we have approximately 25,000 public schools in South Africa and 1,600 independent schools. The public schools serve approximately 13 million students, and that is about 25% of our population. And there are over 400,000 teachers working in those schools. Now, if you don't know about the quintile system, it's something you need to understand because different schools and different quintiles reacted to reopening differently. The quintile system is supposed to fund public schools in a more equitable manner that supports the poor. But I say supposed to because, as you're going to see shortly, it doesn't really do a very good job. We're going to need a little bit of a backstory here. So, historical awareness, here we go. After 1994, all public schools were initially allowed to charge fees. And the government decided to do this because they didn't actually have the money to fund all schools without fees, nor did they have the money to bring up funding to the levels that were previously being spent on schools for white children across the board. Now, historically, there was a huge discrepancy. Black schools got a fraction of that which white schools got in the budget. They also got substandard infrastructure. And schools out in the homelands, where the majority of black children were forced to stay because their parents couldn't take them to the cities for lack of decent housing or permits or dompas, etc., were even worse. And the government would not pay for their infrastructure at all. Schools had to be built with whatever money the community could cobble together. Hence, mud schools, pit latrines, and no water or electricity. The school on the left of the slide is an example of a former HOA school or a formerly whites-only school. The school in the middle is a classic example of a former DET school or a former school built for Black Africans by the nationalist government in the common areas, that is, in the areas still called South Africa, and that would have been in places like Johannesburg or Cape Town. And the school on the right is an example of a school built in a former homeland or Bantustan. The school on the left is less than 10% of the system. The schools on the middle and right are more than 90% of the system. Now have a look at these two pictures. This picture is the geographic layout of South Africa that I learned at school when I was a child. The beige area indicates what was called the common areas, which was officially in the Republic of South Africa. And the 10 colored areas of discontiguous territories represented what were called The homelands as a euphemism, or the pejorative term taken up by anti-apartheid activists, the Bantustans, which were supposed to be semi-autonomous or independently managed territories. The second picture is from the Department of Basic Education's presentation to Parliament at the end of April 2020. And it shows where schools didn't have water and needed emergency water supply or assistance with sanitation in order to be able to contain COVID. You look at the two maps. Can you see a pattern? Of course, the schools that lack infrastructure of basic form, such as water or sanitation, are the schools in the former Bantustans that parents literally had to build with whatever was available, including, and I am not exaggerating, using something like a burnt-out bus or an abandoned taxi with no wheels as a classroom. The idea in '94 was that parents could subsidize an inadequate budget so that all schools could get as much money as possible. But except it backfired, of course. Schools would exclude children because of non-payment, even when it was clear that their families were too poor to pay. And that was in contradiction to the Constitution's premise that basic education should be an inalienable right for everyone. So in 2006, the government tried to introduce a system of redress towards the poor called the Quintile System. And this was supposed to allocate some more state money to poorer schools, since wealthy families could cross-subsidize their schools or their children's schools with fees. Under the Quintile System, public schools are divided into 5 groups, or quintiles, from the poorest to the wealthiest. Each quintile represents 20% of the schools in the system. The first 3 quintiles, quintiles 1, 2, and 3, are the poorest schools, and they are not allowed to charge fees at all, although they may take donations. These are called fee-free schools, and the government gives them a little bit more money, about R1,000 more per learner than it does the schools in the wealthiest quintile 5. Quintile 4 is allowed to charge fees, but they serve slightly poorer students and hence get a little bit extra money as compared to the wealthiest quintile 5. Now, if you're thinking, hang on, actually, Sarah, that's 3 groups, fee-free, wealthiest, and a middle group, you're right. There are indeed 3 groups, the largest group being the bottom one, which is 60% of schools, and the other 2 groups being 20% each of the system. Now, this looks great in theory, that you're putting up to R1,000 more per child at each school for the poor schools as compared to what you give to the wealthy schools. But any policy analyst worth their salt will tell you that the devil's in the detail. Now, unfortunately, one of the issues is, how do we decide if a school is poor or wealthy? It is far too difficult to go and means test every child at every school every year to know who should pay fees and who shouldn't, especially when we have a large informal economy, which we do. Just an aside, means testing is a term that means evaluating how much money someone has or earns, and hence what kind of taxes and fee charges they are able to pay. So instead, the government uses a very rough, crude metric, which uses a school's location to indicate whether it is a poor or wealthy school. Now, this works fine for schools serving wealthy students because wealthy families don't send their children to poor areas for school. But it doesn't work for commuter schools, which are schools located in wealthy areas, but who serve poor children. There are a lot of examples of these, particularly in the urban provinces, such as the Western Cape and Gauteng, where a school will be designated and funded as if it is quintile 5, i.e. wealthy, but actually serves children who are taxiing and busing in from long distances, from Grassy Park, from Orange Farm, from Manenberg, from Soweto, from Lotus River. And these are not parents who can pay fees. In fact, they're already paying hidden school fees in transport costs. So your first problem, inside quintile 5, you have some very, very poor schools, and you have the wealthiest schools, but they are funded as the same. The second problem is that the fees parents pay absolutely dwarf what the government sends as equity. Remember we said that a poor child gets about $1,000 more than a wealthy child every year? Well, to give you a sense of it, many wealthy schools charge in excess of 40,000 Rand per child per year, and they get most of that. Charging fees and collecting fees are two different problems. So the quintile system is not really addressing the magnitude of the inequality. Moving 1,000 Rand from the rich to the poor is very little compared to the 40,000 plus that wealthy parents pump into the schools for their own children. Have a look at a 3-part YouTube explainer I put together with Equal Education on this in 2017. Not a lot has changed since then. But in essence, the wealthy public schools are about 5 to 7% of the system in total, even though they take up the lion's share of attention in the media when something happens. The other 90+% of the system is very, very different. They mostly have to work with what the government sends, and maybe a little bit extra if the parents can pay a little bit of fees. What the government sends is really not enough. Most of those schools can't hire extra teachers. Most of those schools struggle to maintain their schools' grounds. And most of them do not have enough non-teaching staff to handle admin and maintenance work. Enter COVID. How does a pandemic affect these different types of schools differently? Students at what I like to call a fortified school, which is that wealthy tiny fraction of public schools and also the independent schools, most of whom charge more than a lot of public schools. These schools immediately began to implement online forms of learning. They could assume that their students had internet, data, electricity, and devices, as well as appropriate places where they could sit and work without being disturbed. They could assume that most of their parents were middle class and could afford these things. And the chances were high that their parents were also literate and educated, able to organize homeschooling routine and support their children at work. This is not the case for most schools, what I like to call exposed schools. Most of them do not have any form of internet except beyond their cell phones, which is in a very limited format. Data costs are enormous and pose a barrier to engaging in online learning, as many of you are well aware. Most online materials are only available in English, which is a second, third, or fourth language for most of these learners. And without a teacher who could mediate the content and trans-language for them, they would struggle to understand the materials on their own. They often had not got an adult at home who was able to support. In fact, children in poor households are more likely to be needed to help around the home with increased domestic labor, given that everyone is at home all day under lockdown. Female students in particular reported through Equal Education that they took on disproportionate amounts of domestic work and caring for younger siblings and sick relatives. They certainly did not have time for schoolwork. In short, online learning was a privilege that only the already privileged could access, and it meant that learning inequalities widened during the lockdown. On top of this, as if to make matters more complicated, school feeding schemes stopped when the schools were closed. And for many children, 9 million out of 13 million, this was only square meal they received a day. So opening the schools is a good idea, right? I mean, the poorest are suffering the most while they're closed, right? We should get schools open as soon as possible, yes? It's not quite that obvious or straightforward because it's really, really, really hard to overstate what a mess our schools are in. Teaching and learning, even under normal conditions, is constantly interrupted by issues that schools should not have to shoulder, whether that is feeding scheme, gang violence, health concerns of students, or simply being so tightly staffed that even when normal things happen, like a teacher is sick or their car breaks down, that things fall apart. In my own research, I call this lesson shedding, the school equivalent of load shedding. When Eskom struggles to keep the lights on because there isn't enough power in the grid to serve all who need it, schools struggle to keep lessons going because there are insufficient staff and rooms to host all the teaching and learning that they are tasked with. Our schools are grossly overcrowded. Some have as many as 50 plus children in a class built for 30. Many, as you could see on the map earlier, still do not have water and proper functioning toilet facilities, or are too poor to buy their own, or what they do have is so broken beyond repair and they cannot afford to fix it. Unfortunately, many teachers who work in schools have underlying conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, TB, and asthma. And we have an aging teaching force in our poorer schools, especially where younger teachers don't want to work because of the work conditions. In addition, the sad story is that while the chances of COVID spreading like wildfire with devastating effects were perceived to be very high in the beginning, eventually the science seemed to suggest that children's vulnerability to the virus was a little bit less risky and that they would be in most instances all right. But the science about whether children could make their parents and teachers sick as transmitters and silent vectors of COVID was far less clear at the time. And subsequent research has also suggested that although children experience long-term effects from COVID differently compared to adults, we cannot write off the long-term effects of infection on children either. Physical distancing measures, and I'm sorry, I hate the term social distancing, since we need social togetherness now more than we've ever needed it. But such measures are impossible to enact at most of our schools, as are appropriate hygiene measures without water and toilets. On top of all of this, the grim reality is that because the conditions of teaching and learning under these schools in normal times are so difficult, even when things are working quote unquote as they're supposed to, far too little teaching and learning actually happens. More than 70% of students who register in grade 1 do not make it to grade 12 years later. Most children in South Africa repeat at least 1 year of schooling, many more than one. This means that in our high schools in particular, we have 21 and 22-year-olds. So the argument that children don't conduct COVID or convect COVID to their teachers falls apart when you recognize that the grades we are letting back the earliest, namely our grade 12s, are not children. Many of them in our poorer schools are adults. And so we need to treat schools as places of adult transmission of COVID, not child to adult transmission of COVID. So we're not talking about closing schools and keeping people at home where things are dire versus opening schools and having these wonderful moments of teaching and learning. We're talking more about some severe risk of transmitting a potentially deadly disease in order to get a few scraps of learning happening. Is it worth risking the lives of vulnerable poor parents and teachers for those few scraps? COVID was the straw that broke the camel's back in an overwrought system that was already stretched to its limits. I really recommend this article by Dr. Heather Jacklin for a good summary of these issues. Talk about sitting between a rock and a hard place, and we haven't even talked yet about curriculum, what effects the loss of learning will have on assessment cycles and regimens in the short and long term. So some, for example, called for automatic promotion to the next year of schooling, saying grade 12s should be evaluated for university entrance on their grade 11 results, and that university entry and university should adjust their first year courses. Others included including the DBE, seem to think that the academic year could and should be saved, even as schools closed as quickly as they opened and teachers tested positive for COVID and institutions shut down for deep cleaning. And so many asked, is it even possible to save the academic year in any meaningful way? And also other debates opened up about how full CAPS is as a curriculum in the face of any type of time lost in learning. There's also been a contention that somehow because children aren't in school, they aren't learning. And that eclipses and erases a lot of important learning that happens at home and in community and devalues forms of knowledge that are not in the school curriculum. For example, are children watching how the adults in their lives behave under moments of stress where conflict management and compromise are required? Some more issues. Some argued that schools need to be open so children can be fed. Others countered, children always need food, whether they're at school or not. What about evenings? What about holidays? What about weekends? Children need food, not just when they're at school. And using schools as a shield against starvation is not the way to go. If people can't feed themselves and their children, this is an issue for the Department of Social Development. And others should step in to organize food parcels and make sure that people can eat. There's been a heated debate about what is to be done with unattended minors when parents go back to work if the schools are not open. But this is also not as clear as it might seem, since parental working hours seldom synchronize with school hours, never mind reduced COVID school hours. With only some grades returning, this is an argument that's pretty moot anyway. Children who are not back at school because it's not their grades day are still at home without adult supervision. But these issues highlight an important concern, that schools are tasked with doing so much more than just teaching and learning. They can be useful community centers to provide access to public services, watch over children, and provide food. But unless they are kitted out and staffed to fulfill these functions in addition to lessons, these duties begin to crowd out teaching and learning instead of supporting it. Some advocates who have been arguing for better school infrastructure and for better staffing of schools have been frustrated at the excessive expenditure on consumables to keep schools open while the pandemic is running its course. This money was for things like masks, sanitizer, and thermometers, the latter being a strange purchase given most COVID-infected children are asymptomatic. And this group of people argued that this money could have been spent on more classrooms, fixing broken classrooms, toilets, and tap water, and fixing infrastructure that is more reliable instead of temporary prefabs. In essence, three positions have emerged as to what to do regarding school closures during COVID. The first position is, don't worry, go back to school. The pandemic risk is overstated, the kids will be all right. It's not worth risking the academic year, and next year's grade 1s and this year's grade 12s can't be made to suffer. The second group argue that we'll go back to school, but only a few at the time. We'll make sure that schools are cleaned and people have PPEs, temporary toilets, and at least some water tankers. We'll close the school if someone gets sick. We'll do what we can to protect the vulnerable, but we need to get some kind of teaching and learning happening again. And this has been the dominant policy position of the DBE. And the third position is keep schools closed. Take the time to fix the mess that they are in, repair broken toilets and water supply, build extra classrooms, and upskill teachers who require extra training. By all means, run feeding schemes and send homework packs home via feeding schemes, also using public broadcast media to continue lessons across radio and TV, which are the most freely accessible forms of digital media to everyone. But only open schools once the pandemic peak has passed. A further question that we haven't even begun to explore is what are the effects that happen when some schools go back and other schools can't? Now, each position has its merits and its issues. What is the right thing to do? It's not clear at all. Each position would play out differently across the inequalities described in the first part of this section, and clearly each position is taking a very different type of time horizon over which the idea of good and right is adjudicated. There are clear tensions between the needs of some groups and the needs of others. You can see how a mom with diabetes in Mitchell's Plain, whose child has asthma, might not want to send their child to school. You can also see how, at the same time, a grandmother in Kailicha might feel that her granddaughter will be fed and safe if school is opened. You can understand how a matric might be worried about the university opportunities next year, but at the same time, their parents want them to stay home and healthy and feel like matric can be rewritten, but death is permanent. Now, no amount of reasoning makes one person seem more rational than the other. Each has merits to their position. Do you remember the scenario from the last session where the teacher got asked to fiddle the marks? In that scenario, we observed that the contradictions and trade-offs involved came from the fact that the problem was being addressed at the wrong point. Now, we could make a similar argument about this pandemic moment, that if schools were adequately equipped, if people weren't living in abject poverty, and if we'd built a society that was safe and fair for everyone, we wouldn't be facing these dilemmas. Being at home would not mean risking starving. We could close schools and initiate online learning for everyone until it was safe to open again. When we did reopen, we would have enough staff and spaces to keep appropriate protocols in place and prevent sickness from spreading. In short, COVID didn't generate the inequality and deprivation. Rather, in the words of Arundhati Roy, it's acted like an MRI on the body of our society. It's let us peek beneath the skin and see the sickness that was already there. Sonia Renee Taylor wrote, "We will not go back to normal because normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal. Other than that, we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, and extraction. We should not long to return, my friends, for we are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." Based on what Taylor wrote, perhaps we want to ask ourselves, do we want to go back to school? If going back to school means going back to what we had before. In summary, in this session, we have looked at some of the ethical concerns thrown up by the issue of school closures during the COVID pandemic. We used some historical awareness and sociological imagination to appreciate the complexities, and we outlined some of the different factors that need to be considered, including how much space schools have, students' home conditions, teachers' and caregivers' vulnerability and how at risk they are, what alternative social functions schools play, and whether they should be expected to fulfill these roles, as well as the potential consequences for students in the following year if the academic year gets cancelled or compromised. We've not even scratched the surface of what happens with schools opening and shutting, and what that kind of arrhythmia does to routine and timetabling, which is my own area of research interest. In the end, we sketched 3 positions and found pluralism deluxe. And finally, we asked the question of whether the contradictions of the existing moment are not a function of a longer arc of failing to deal with historical injustice and inequality. Stay safe, look after yourself. In the next session, we'll look at ethics education in the body. I'll see you next time.